Hello and welcome to another episode of Palestine This Week with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin, Rabbani. Mouin, as always, it's a pleasure to see you.
Very good to see you again, Nassim. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. So, Mouin, I want to begin with the big story, Trump's visit to the region. He went to Egypt, where we saw the signing of the so-called peace plan. And then he delivered a speech at the Israeli Knesset. I want to speak about those two events. And then we'll discuss the hostage deal, Hamas clashing with Israeli armed militias in the Gaza Strip. If Hamas can regain control and address the rising influence, I would say, the militias that was funded by Israel. And then we'll have a discussion about new details that were released by Plus 972 magazine, which really is an industrial scale misinformation campaign by Israel that has been carried out over the past 2 years. And if time permits, we'll discuss some of the other issues which I have on the list. But let's begin, as I said, with Trump's visit to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, where he signed a deal, and many other Arab leaders and Muslim leaders also signed this document. It looked like some kind of grand peace plan. We don't know the full details of what that is, but what are they exactly signing? I mean, there's no Palestinian representative there. Trump presented this as some kind of a deal of the century, which all the Muslim countries have agreed to, and they're signing this document. What is this document, and what is it trying to achieve? It seemed more like a performance to me, presented to the rest of the world about how Trump's leading this, major peace plan. But what is this peace plan? It's a ceasefire, but nothing more. Whether it will hold or not, we don't know yet. But it's been presented as this amazing peace plan.
Yeah, well, a lot has happened in the past week, and let's try to put the different pieces of the puzzle together. On the 8th of October, Hamas and Israel reached an agreement on the immediate issues that were addressed in the Trump, or more accurately, Trump-Netanyahu proposal unveiled at the White House on the 29th of September. So it dealt with cessation of hostilities. It dealt with an exchange of captives. They agreed maps on the first phase, perhaps the last phase also, of the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and also addressed the need for a surge in humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. And crucially, the death squad known as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been dismantled. Its staff put their tail between their legs and ran off back to their Israeli and American masters. And the United Nations is now once again in charge of the aid delivery system in the Gaza Strip. Um, Trump, you know, the vain narcissist, of course, wanted to be at the very center of this. And in fairness, even though even though the intensification of the genocide and the famine since March of this year could not have happened without his support and consent, it is also true that this agreement could not have happened without him, because in contrast to Biden, Trump was prepared to pick up the phone and tell Netanyahu, this it ends now, enough is enough. But he wanted very much to be the center of attention, as he always does. But in addition to that, I think there's also another factor, that he was being asked for guarantees that the genocide will not resume, that the guns have fallen silent. And it seems that on the one hand, he was unprepared to give kind of written commitments to this effect, except to announce an end to the war, but that he also sought to accommodate those demands by going to the region, announcing an end to the war in front of Israel's parliament, and then signing a document to that effect at this meeting that was conducted in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So Trump came to the region. I think we're going to discuss his address.
Speech at the Knesset, address
Yeah,
at the Knesset. Yeah, yeah.
we'll discuss that later. But then immediately afterwards, he went to Sharm el Sheikh. Now, this was a gathering of regional and international leaders. The Italian Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister, a few others were there, as well as a number of Arab leaders and leaders of Turkey, Pakistan, and Indonesia. The Pakistani I can't remember if it was the president or the prime minister, of course, once again nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And curiously, the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, was there, but was kind of, kept hidden, like like a mistress or an errant child, and was really nowhere to be seen in the public aspects of the ceremonies. And at one point, apparently under American pressure or at an American suggestion, the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah Sisi, invited the Israeli leader, the wanted war criminal, Benjamin Netanyahu, to also participate in this meeting, in this gathering, in this ceremony. And according to press reports, what happened is that the airplane of the Turkish leader Erdogan was preparing to land in Sharm el Sheikh when Erdogan got word that Netanyahu would be there and made clear in no uncertain terms to the Egyptian hosts that if Netanyahu is indeed permitted to participate in this event, that he will order his pilot not to land and to return to Ankara. There are also reports that a few other leaders expressed similar views. So, first, Netanyahu announced that he would be going to Sharm el Sheikh, and then he conveniently remembered that there is a Jewish holiday, and that this, of course, prevents him from going to Sharm el Sheikh. So that's the background. And curiously, there were two others who were also absent. The leader of the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, and the leader of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and um, uh, the Emirati leader sent a junior assistant. So at this event, you had all these leaders, and a document was produced that was signed, if I'm not mistaken, by only four leaders: the Americans, the Egyptians, the Turks, and the Qataris. The others did not sign this. But in the end, it doesn't really matter because if you look at the text of this agreement, it says absolutely nothing. I mean, it hails Trump as all but a deity at various points in the document. And it speaks of the importance of peace and that everyone is committed to peace and that everyone will do everything they can to ensure that peace is achieved and to, put war behind them and so on. But what exactly the political disposition of such a peace looks like is left entirely unmentioned. I think Palestinians are mentioned once. There's absolutely no mention of Palestinian self determination, of Palestinian rights, of a Palestinian state. And it's just kind of all this boilerplate, that you could get at some feel good rally. So there is no peace plan. We have the Trump Netanyahu initiative, which is really a glorified ceasefire proposal. And then you have the Sharm el Sheikh document that says absolutely nothing about where the region is heading to. And so my interpretation would be that the rationale for all this pomp and circumstance was to reassure those who were demanding assurances that the genocide will not resume, that through Trump's personal involvement, his address to the Israeli parliament, his participation in this Sharm el Sheikh meeting, and affixing a signature to this, that, and the other, that this should serve as an assurance that the United States will ensure that Israel does not basically abrogate what it has agreed to, does not sabotage further negotiations, and once again resume with its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip.
I mean, some may say, we're being very negative, don't be so negative. Wait and see how this plays out. Of course, we're all pleased that the hostages are released, but they'll say, okay, let's wait and see how this plays out. But for people like you and I, this has been presented as a peace deal. If you were to compare previous peace deals, like, for example, Oslo 1993, at least there was a recognition, an idea of a peace plan, and the issues that were the main sticking points, the final status issues, or we will negotiate them in years to come. But here, there's no mention of Palestinian, as you said, state, Israel's borders, occupation, Jerusalem, all the key aspects of the universal consensus on what should be the recognized settlement of the Israel-Palestine question. Nothing is addressed. So this is why you and I are probably very negative, because as I said, it's presented as some grand peace plan, but it's nothing of the sort. It's just release of the hostages. So I don't really know what these guys are signing up to, nor do you really.
Well, let's make a distinction between what we are seeing now and Oslo. Oslo also wasn't a peace plan. It also didn't lay out a clear objective for a resolution of Israeli-Palestinian relations. It certainly didn't mention self-determination, statehood, or even occupation. It at least did identify those issues you mentioned, borders, settlements, refugees, and so on. It at least identified them as issues that needed to be addressed and resolved. What we have now says absolutely nothing about these issues. So it doesn't even invoke them as ones that need to be eventually addressed, let alone resolved, let alone resolved in line with the international consensus and the recent International Court of Justice advisory opinion, for example, that defines Israeli rule in the occupied territories as illegal. So we're dealing with a much lower political ceiling. Against that, in 1993, I think you can make a persuasive argument that the Palestinian leadership signed this agreement basically for very narrow considerations out of opportunism to prevent their further irrelevance on the regional and international stage and so on. And there wasn't a compelling reason for it to do so. And if it had held out, it may well have achieved better terms, such as a moratorium on settlement expansion, pending a resolution of what were termed final status issues. Here we're dealing with a very different situation. There is no peace plan, there is no political horizon, there is no process to get to a discussion of the political issues. But against that, you have two factors. On the one hand, we are dealing with an active and intensifying genocide, and those who have negotiated this, I think quite rightly, viewed the most important and urgent priority as bringing that genocide to a halt, even if that halt proves ultimately to be temporary. And secondly, while this new process aims to ensnare the Palestinians once again into an interminable process of negotiations about essentially nothing that will achieve nothing, at least in 2025, in sharp contrast to 1993, you do have this alternative global dynamic, which is gaining in strength, which is basically seeking to hold Israel accountable to its actions, to ensure it complies with international law, to ensure that Western states comply with their obligations under international law. Now, that's by no means going to be the way things develop in the coming months, but at least you now have an alternative that can be used to leverage the process that exists. So I think, yes, we can say this is the issue is not so much whether this is a good or a bad plan. It isn't really a plan to begin with. So that makes it very difficult to assess. We can say that it has, at least for the time being, put an end to the Gaza genocide, and that's why you see people celebrating in the Gaza Strip. But at the same time, it only checks one box on a substantial to-do list. And that's why you see, for example, that there are still massive demonstrations being held in European cities and elsewhere, because, this time people realize that the mere existence of a document with Palestinian and Israeli signatures on it does not provide an assurance that you can pack up and go home and hope for the best. We learned that already in the 1990s. This time, the pressure needs to be maintained. In fact, it needs to be intensified to ensure that equality is achieved and that peaceful coexistence can be achieved, and that we don't just go back to the horrible situation that existed on October 6, 2023, because if we do, then the countdown to the next October 7th has already begun, as has a countdown for the 2 years that followed October 7th. And I think people are much more aware of these realities this time around.
Which is why there's this row that's taking place in social media where the pro-genociders are saying, "Oh, look, Trump has ended the killing. Why don't you guys celebrate?" But people aren't celebrating because they know there is no concrete guarantees, that we haven't really begun the snowballing effect to another massive attack against the Palestinians. So that is the main reason, and people have seen the history and how it plays out. And these so-called ceasefire and peace plan has never really addressed the core underlying issues, which is the occupation, and this is no different.
Yeah.
So,
Can I just make a point about that? This
sure.
is this is such, to put it politely, BS. What these Israel flunkies are claiming is that people around the world who have mobilized consistently for 2 years, often at personal cost, in order to demand an end to the genocide. The claim that's being put forward now is that these people are upset that the guns have fallen silent, that they want the war to continue, and that's why they're not cheering. That's absolutely not what is happening. People have been demanding an end to genocide for 2 years. Um, I haven't met anyone who, at least anyone who supports Palestinian rights, who hasn't welcomed an end to the slaughter. But at the same time, this is also about much more issues to ensure that the slaughter doesn't happen again. And that's why people are still demonstrating. So, of course, and it's quite clear this is an organized campaign, because it seems like the email went out or the message went out. And
Yeah.
almost simultaneously, in unison, all the usual suspects started saying, "Oh, you're against the ceasefire. You want the war to continue. This was never about genocide, which doesn't exist anyway." So it's pure propaganda. Um, and certainly, in Palestine, people have been celebrating this agreement, even if they are quite rightly very cynical about it. But the idea that people have been demonstrating for a resumption of the war, rather than for ensuring it permanently comes to an end and the underlying crisis is addressed, it's pure propaganda.
Yeah, exactly. And he also delivered a speech in the Israeli Knesset. So I want to ask two questions about that. First, um, he addressing the members of the Knesset, he said, "You've won. Now it's time to translate these victories on the battlefield into ultimate prize of peace and prosperity in the Middle East." Of course, I mean, many within the Israeli Knesset, people like Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, they are opposed to this ceasefire. They want to, of course, occupy the Gaza Strip. And you also had Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, who issued a tweet where he said that we basically resume the killing in the Gaza Strip as soon as the hostages are released. That's basically kind of what he said. So there's two aspects to that. I mean, the Israelis, there isn't the, I would say, the support which within the Israeli Knesset, which Trump thinks there is. And also many within the Knesset will be, I think, not surprised, but I think um, they would be opposed to this idea that Hamas can come back and rule Gaza. Because President Trump himself, when he was asked on Air Force One on his way to Sharm el Sheikh about Hamas uh, enforcing security in the Gaza Strip, and what his thought was that about that. And he came out and he said that they were doing this under his approval, and Hamas was enforcing security because they were given the green light to do so. They were maintaining internal security. So there was this sense that Trump was okay with that. So will the Israelis be happy with this deal? And especially given that Hamas is still alive, still enforcing security, and and at the behest, it seems, from what Trump says, of him.
Look, Palestinians have lost enormously during the past two years. That's indisputable. I mean, they were subject to a 24-month genocide that intensified with each passing day. Hamas has lost enormously. It is a very substantially weakened organization in 2025 compared to 2023. Israel, for its part, has failed to achieve its objectives. Of course, genocide and reducing the Gaza Strip to rubble was an important objective for Israel. But no Israeli leader can get up and say, we have achieved the total victory we set out to. Hamas is vanquished, no longer exists. Not a single one of its militants dares emerge in public, and so on. So, in that sense, fighting when a regional superpower fights the longest war in its history against a poorly armed militia and an essentially defenseless population and cannot emerge with an indisputable image of victory, that's a failure for them as well. Now, the key question is, of course, this is not just about who performed better on the battlefield. This is about how the 24 months have affected the question of Palestine. And so the key question that is now before us is, have we witnessed the beginning of the end of the Palestinian question from an Israeli perspective, in the sense that they have demonstrated that they are able to unilaterally wipe the Palestinians off the face of the earth, and that they will never have to um, again answer for their policies towards the Palestinians and are free to do as they please for the rest of time? Or has this been a turning point akin to Sharpeville, Soweto, the Tet Offensive, the Battle of Algiers, the Easter Rising, what have you, which were not successful in a conventional military sense, but transformed the political context, and ultimately were an important step on the way to freedom for those who launched these offensives. You can think of the Mau Mau Rebellion, of course, and Kenya, and many other examples. That's an unanswered question, but by the looks of it, there seems to be a consensus that Israel has irretrievably, irreversibly lost the global public square, that the political support that Israel has always been able to rely on is beginning to dissipate. And we're really now in a race against time. Will Israel be able to retain enough impunity for long enough to achieve a decisive outcome? Or will this drain fast enough that Palestinians can achieve their freedom and liberation? Now, as far as Trump is concerned, again, he went to the Israeli parliament and he gave this talk where he basically first, basked in the glory of the very organized flattery, because, the Israelis understand, I think everyone understands, the way to Trump's heart is through absolute abject sycophancy. And that was exactly, Netanyahu gave this long speech where you would think he was talking about God rather than Trump. They gave him yet another award and so on. And then when Trump spoke, he, of course, also made all these flattering comments about Israel. Um, but if you notice, he was basically met with one uninterrupted standing ovation. But there were a few times where the applause was muted to absent, and that was when he spoke about the war having come to an end, which is of course an unwelcome message to the ears of many of his audience in the Israeli parliament. But I think that perhaps should be seen in the context of Washington being asked to provide assurances, guarantees that it will ensure the genocide does not resume. Now, what these statements are worth is, of course, a completely different matter because the future of this agreement, I think, will be decided by other factors, not by statements by Trump or anyone else.
We should point out, I don't think Trump received as many standing ovations as Netanyahu did when he
It would have
goes.
been close.
You think so? Yeah, I know I should tell him that Netanyahu got more
I
in
can't count
Congress.
that high anyway. So,
Yeah. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier how Hamas has been trying to crack down on the Israeli armed militias, the Abu Shebab gang. So these Israeli armed militias with ISIS sympathies, who have been causing a lot of mischief over the past 2 years, aided by the Israelis. So now they're clashing with those militias and those gangs. So do you think, of course, Sunday, one of the leading Palestinian journalists, he was killed in those exchange between Hamas and the militias. Do you think Hamas will be able to get a handle over these militias, or is that going to be another challenge? Because there is speculation that they will continue to be armed. They may even seek refuge in the sections Israel still controls in Gaza. Israel will continue to arm them, and Israel will continue to assassinate, kill Palestinians through its proxy in the form of these militias inside the Gaza Strip. So there is, even though Israel has withdrawn from parts of Gaza, it still has the means and the capacity and the ability to cause a lot of mischief and bloodshed in the Gaza Strip.
mm. Well, I mean, following on from the previous question, it is of course in Hamas's interest to show, we are still here. We are able to openly operate with our weapons and to impose our authority, to impose law and order on the Gaza Strip. And then you had Trump coming out and saying, we were made aware of this, and the situation is so chaotic that we feel there's actually a need for Hamas to do this on a temporary basis. And then there is, of course, the entirely separate issue of the future governance and administration of the Gaza Strip, and that's another whole and separate discussion that hasn't really started yet. But what we're talking about here is that Israel has established or adopted and sponsored a number of militias. Israel likes to present these as clan based militias. That there are a number of families and clans within the Gaza Strip who have disputes with Hamas and have therefore thrown in their lot with Israel against Hamas. It's actually not like that at all. What you have is basically gangsters, groups of gangsters who, like, for example, Abu Shebab is a convicted drug smuggler with links to ISIS, and so on, who has been disowned by his own family. Then in the northern Gaza Strip, we keep hearing about the Dormosh militia. Well, the Dormosh is a prominent clan, but this militia is not the Dormosh militia. It's a militia composed of members of the Dormosh clan who have been sponsored and armed and adopted by Israel, but who have also been renounced and denounced by the leaders of the Dormosh clan. And again, the reports are not very clear on this, but what appears to have happened is that when Israel carried out the first phase of its withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in accordance with the agreement signed this month, these militias sought Israeli permission to reestablish themselves behind Israeli lines, and Israel refused. And so they were sent in basically to do exactly what they've been doing, to sow chaos, death, and destruction. And it was that spurred Hamas to then crack down on them very severely. Of course, yes, there should be proper justice and trials and so on. But, when you've destroyed every single courthouse and killed many of the officials of the Justice Ministry and so on, it's a bit hypocritical to then get all high and mighty about the summary execution of collaborators. I think the issue here is that in several cases, Hamas's campaign against these militias appears to have expanded beyond the collaborators themselves against others who were viewed as opponents of Hamas without them having any clear relationship with Israel. But I'm sure we'll find out more about this in the days to come. But of course, now the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra is now that Gazans are being slaughtered by their own people, nobody cares because it was always about hating the Jews and all this nonsense. No, these are collaborators who have been sent into the Gaza Strip to ensure the maximum amount of chaos and so on. And they have been very firmly confronted not only by Hamas but also by others, and certainly in the absence of a functioning judiciary, and given also that, as in any similar situation, people are very eager to grab these bastards by the throat, given what they have done on behalf of Israel during the past 2 years. Of course, you're going to get summary justice. Of course, you're going to get human rights violations. Of course, you're going to get summary executions. I mean, look at what happened in France after World War II. Look at what happened in any similar situation. So take your sanctimony somewhere else.
I think it's a universal theme. I mean, when you've
Yeah,
just survived a genocide and
yes,
there are parties within your country, sections within your population that have been supporting, aiding, stealing food, causing blood
exactly.
mayhem. I mean, I don't know any society where it hasn't happened. Anyway,
Yep.
we'll come to that later on. Before we move on, I wanted to ask you about another thing from Trump's address to the Knesset. It was a spectacle where he was praising Miriam Edelson. She's the wife of the late Sheldon
Sheldon.
Adelson, multi-billionaire, worth I think something like 60. I think he said 60 billion. I think he said, and I think what he was saying would have been cringe to the ears of so many who are telling us, there's nothing to see when it comes to Israel's influence on American
Yeah,
politicians,
because of course
American
Israel
presidents.
doesn't have any influence.
And here he is coming out saying, everything he's been doing in both his terms has really been because he has received millions of pounds from the Adelsons. And at one point he said that, Sheldon Adelson, before he passed away, was a very aggressive man. He would phone up and request to meet him in the White House. And Trump would say, look, it's not the same anymore. I'm the president. And it's almost like, he was bowing to this guy, Sheldon Adelson. So things he was saying would be labeled as anti-Semitic if it was anyone else other than President Trump. But here he is saying, Adelson, they are Israel first, not America
Mhm.
first. They're more loyal to Israel than they're to the US. and saying that his U.S. foreign policy has literally been sold out to these two Zionist fanatics. It's a crazy thing to say, but he said it in the Knesset.
Yeah, I mean, God forbid you ever suggest that there is a single American operating on behalf of Israel. You know, you're perfectly free to say that they're agents of Qatar, of Saudi Arabia, of Russia, of China, of any country on earth. But God forbid you suggest there's a single American who is acting on behalf of Israel and therefore should register as a foreign agent. You know, God forbid you say that there's a single you American whose ultimate loyalty is to a foreign power, to Israel. God forbid you say that there's a single wealthy American who is making campaign donations in order to promote the interests of Israel. You can say that about any other country, but when you say that about Israel, you might as well be operating the gas chambers at Auschwitz. You know, it's just so beyond the pale to suggest that that politics and lobbying and Israel intersect the same way they do with every other country. But you know, yeah, like you said, Trump is Trump. He has no what do you call it? He has no internal policeman or restraints, or maybe he wanted to make this point, and he basically explained that he's been bought and paid for by the Adelsons, and that you know they have tens of billions of dollars. They're his largest campaign contributors, and therefore he did as they requested. You know, Jerusalem, and particularly the Golan Heights, the recognition of Israel's claims of sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And he concluded by saying, you know, I asked Miriam Adelson, um, I know you love Israel, but what do you love more, Israel and the United States? And then he said she refused to respond, which is a response, of course, in and of itself. Now, was he just saying this, you know, because that's how he is? Was this perhaps a shot across the bow, that, you know, if you don't get into line, I have something on you? It's unclear. Time will tell. But this, of course, um, will be seen as confirmation by many people that Trump is in thrall to the Israel lobby, that Israel has undue influence in Washington, which of course it does. But it would be, I think, a pity if the lesson people draw from this is that somehow the United States is a proxy of Israel, rather than understand that ultimately it is Israel that is a proxy of the United States. I mean, let's not forget this agreement that we've been discussing so far today. It is not an agreement that Netanyahu wanted. It is one that he didn't want to accept, that he was very reluctant to even engage with. But the minute Trump told him, this is what you're going to do, Netanyahu obeyed like the good little proxy that he is and that he has always been.
Hmm. What's interesting when Trump says these things is he basically discounts the idea that US support for Israel is to do with some strategic reason or even so-called Judeo-Christian civilization. He doesn't even go into that discussion. He basically says that it's because they donate millions of
Yeah,
pounds to me. This is
money
the
talks.
reason. This is the reason, and I think more and more people are realizing for all these years, including the Iraq War in 2003, when the book The Israel Lobby by Moshe and Waltz was published, they were accused of being anti-Semitic.
Of course.
You had a number of Jewish commentators would come out and say, no, it's got nothing to do with the Israeli lobby. It's to do with the fact that Israel serves a strategic interest for the Americans, whether it be policing the Middle East, and also there is the other dimension which we keep hearing about, the Judeo-Christian civilization and upholding Judeo-Christian values. Trump just brushes all that aside. He said, "No, it's got nothing to do with that. It's to do with the fact that
They
they give
paid
me,
me.
they pay me, and this is why I do it." And it's the most anti-Semitic trope I guess you can come up with. And he says that it's true. That's, I mean, he's saying it's true. He's a representation of that. That's what I find really curious and
Well,
revealing.
he was basically confirming what we already knew. You know, U.S. politics is an auction house. You buy officials and you sell them. It's like a marketplace. And he's basically confirming, that the Israelis participate in this marketplace the same way everyone else does. Um, but the way we're supposed to understand U.S. politics is that yes, the defense industry, the war industry, the pharmaceuticals, the Qataris, the Saudis, they're all seeking to corrupt U.S. politics and U.S. politicians. Israel alone refuses to engage with this. And the only reason anyone ever supports Israel is because they have the purest of intentions, the purest of hearts. They're looking at this solely in terms of what is the best interests of the United States. The idea that people are actually seeking to further an Israeli agenda is absolute sacrilege. It means, you're either Al Qaeda or a National Socialist or whatever. And Trump just explained to us Israel is no different than anyone else. The only distinction Israel has is that it's much more effective than everyone else.
Mm, Firstly, yeah, let's turn our attention to the actual hostage deal itself. I just got 2 points to make and get your thoughts on that first. The just I guess the sheer double standards we are seeing with regards to the language that's being used in the release of the hostages. So 2,000 Palestinian hostages have been released, of which only 250 you could say were convicted criminals. Convicted by who? By Israel, which has a 99.99% conviction rate. And these are people who allegedly committed violent crimes according to Israel. But the vast majority, 1,700, were Palestinians who would have been taken hostage. They would have been held without trial. They would have been kidnapped for various reasons. But despite that, there is no mass media coverage of the fact that Palestinians are also hostages in much, much, much larger numbers. So your thoughts on that, and also the fact that Marwan Barghouti, who was on Hamas on the top of Hamas's list to be released, but Israel rejected that. So, what's the significance of that, and
Yeah.
also your general view about the fact that there's such a double standard when it comes to
Oh,
recognizing the
absolutely.
humanity of the
Yeah.
Palestinian hostages?
A Palestinian who is held captive by Israel is by definition a terrorist. Otherwise, Israel, of course, would have never arrested this person. An autistic child who is being held for months by Israel under the most brutal conditions. He's a Palestinian, he's a terrorist. Dr. Adnan al Bursh, a medical doctor, detained, raped, literally raped to death. Oh, he's Palestinian? That means he's a terrorist. But then you have an armed soldier in uniform seized from his tank, and you have all Western media talking about this guy being kidnapped, for God's sake. You know, what, where else in history have soldiers ever been kidnapped from the battlefield? And since he's Israeli, he's a hostage. If Hannibal Lecter had been seized by Hamas on October 7th, they would have described him as a hostage. It's just the decades of a campaign of systematic dehumanization of Palestinians on the one hand and glorification of Israel and Israelis on the other hand is what led us to this point. Armed Israeli soldiers on active duty are kidnapped from their tank and taken hostage. Autistic Palestinian children are prisoners or terrorists or whatever. And yes, 1,700 of the 2,000 Palestinians released in this exchange um, were Palestinian non-combatant civilians who have not been charged with anything, who are the very definition of a hostage, and who Israel itself at various points said it was keeping solely to exercise pressure on Hamas in the context of a captive exchange. Now, the agreement itself was very lopsided. If you remember, at the beginning, Hamas repeatedly insisted that there were only two resolutions of this file it would accept: either all Palestinian captives released for all Israeli captives in one go, or a phased release of all Palestinian captives in exchange for a phased relief of all Israeli captives. Well, if you look at what they ultimately decided, um, they Hamas was able to obtain the release of less than a quarter of Palestinian captives. So from that point of view, it was quite clearly a failure. But Hamas was had to make one of two choices, arguably, either to insist on a better exchange of captives, but at the expense of an intensification of the genocide in a context where there was a proposal on the table and they were under massive regional and international pressure to accept it. And of course, Hamas will seek to justify this by saying that the prisoners who were not released in this exchange themselves were urging Hamas to accept this agreement to end the genocide. So, how convincing that will prove is a different question. Now, there were two key prisoners who Hamas had always insisted needed to be in this exchange who weren't. The first is Marwan Barghouti. Um, and Barghouti is seen as the one leader who can potentially not only rejuvenate, excuse me, who can not only rejuvenate the Fatah movement, um, but can serve as an effective bridge builder between Fatah and Hamas and other movements to reunify the Palestinian national movement and revive it as an effective force. That's how he's seen. And that's also how he's seen by Israel. So Israel was going to do everything possible to prevent his release, precisely because that's the role he it sees him as playing, and it doesn't want to be confronted with the political ramifications of that. Secondly, I think we also need to recognize that the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas has also consistently preferred to see Barghouti rotting in prison because he is also seen as the most effective challenger to Mahmoud Abbas. And I would not at all be surprised to learn that secret messages were passed from the Palestinian Authority to the Israelis, to the Americans, not to release Barghouti. There have certainly been credible accusations of it doing so in the past, including, I should add, by Barghouti's wife, Fadwa. Ahmed Saadat leads a popular front for the liberation of Palestine. He was the PFLP's general secretary when it carried out the only successful Palestinian assassination of an Israeli cabinet official, Rehavam Ze'evi, a far right, I think he was Minister of Tourism at the time, in, I believe, 2002 or 2003. So, out of a lust for revenge, Israel is never going to release him unless it's forced to do so. So these two, unfortunately, will continue to remain in prison indefinitely and perhaps even die in prison because after they were excluded from the 2011 prisoner exchange, I think many people felt this exchange that has just been concluded was arguably their last opportunity to get out alive. Now, according to the terms of the agreement, um, Israel was supposed to release 250 Palestinian captives who were serving life sentences. According to reports, they've only released 195. Whether the others will be released later or Israel has reneged on its commitments is unclear. But we also know that a number of those who have already been released, who were supposed to be returned to their homes in the West Bank, were at the last minute deported. So, Israel's attitude to an agreement it has concluded is that respecting the terms of that agreement is really optional. That if Israel is dissatisfied with the terms of an agreement that it has signed, it maintains complete freedom to implement it completely differently. It's always been that way.
Your answer reminded me of the Israeli complaint, which is that, the reason we don't have peace is because there's no partner for peace on the Palestinian side. But if you look at history, and Barghouti is an example, it's because Israel either imprisons, or kills, or assassinates every one of the effective Palestinian leaders. That's been the case throughout history.
Well, it
Which
tried to assassinate the entire Hamas negotiating team, which had been specifically convened at American request to study a proposal to end this war. I mean, what more evidence do you need?
Yeah, that's true. Of course, goes far back, even
Mm, mm,
1936 during
yeah.
the first Intifada, or the uprising. I think 10% of Palestinian leadership were either imprisoned, killed, or they had to flee. So, I think some crazy statistics, which then took many, many decades for the Palestinians to recover and assemble and create new leadership to take on
Yes.
their cause. So that's another history lesson. But the reason is exactly that. The fate of Marwan Barghouti is a long case or tradition of Israel either imprisoning, killing, assassinating Palestinian leaders that are effective on the ground. That's one of the main reasons why you have no partner for peace.
Yes.
Let's move on to um, another. I would say it's a really interesting and important story from last week. It was in the Plus 972 magazine, which exposed how Israel's industrial scale misinformation, gaslighting, and propaganda has been carried out. And in this instance, Plus 972 magazine showed that. Remember, Israel showed these images of Shifa Hospital and many other hospitals and the allegation was there were bunkers underneath, there were information command centers underneath. And now it turns out those images, 3D images, were basically fake, manufactured from video games, manufactured from 3D animations from various sites from across the social media. Of course, we knew this was all manufactured and misinformation and lied to justify Israel going into hospitals, bombing hospitals, mosques, and everything else. But now Plus 972 has shown how exactly Israel has been doing this, manufacturing these 3D images to justify its assault on hospitals.
Look, Plus 972 is not a technology company. It's a news magazine that also conducts investigative journalism. What distinguishes it is it appears to have good sources within the Israeli security establishment, and it was able to bring the receipts and to demonstrate and confirm, that all these phenomenally detailed animated videos we've been shown about, the Hamas Pentagon under the Al-Shifa hospital, of all these other supposed Hamas facilities, are all fake. That what Israel's military did is it basically found these animated images on the web, showing facilities in Scotland and in other places, and then repurposed them entirely out of thin air as Hamas command facilities in the Gaza Strip. And the point all credit to 972 and its partner Local Call and their correspondence. But the reason I'm it's not a particularly wealthy or technologically sophisticated outfit. So the point I would make is that those Western media organizations that have, incomparably more resources than this small magazine. I'm thinking of, CNN, the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the others who lapped this up and amplified it and amplified it and amplified it and gave it the credibility that Israel required to go into the main Palestinian hospital in the Gaza Strip, murder people to the extent that mass graves were required to dispose of their bodies, and then raise this entire medical center to the ground. Those same organizations that were instrumental in making this atrocity possible had the resources to investigate this. they could have reached exactly the same conclusions that Plus 972 magazine has now provided us with, because they have the money, they have the investigative reporters, they have the technological staff that could have very easily verified this before the atrocity that they were absolutely central to enabling, to legitimizing. These media organizations have blood on their hands. They have so much blood on their hands, it will never wash away.
Think you raise a really important point here. I mean, I remember growing up, every single news agency, whether it be the BBC, BBC Two, Channel 4, all the ones when we were growing up, they always had once a week or at least once a month an investigative piece, an investigation which was in the service of the average person, in the service of humanity, in the service of truth. None of this exists anymore. Every
Mm,
investigation is really in the service of some corporation, some lobbyist
mm,
to
Yep.
push an agenda, anti-Muslim this, or scaremongering about migrants. So the investigations that used to happen before were in the service of something, I would say, noble, a noble cause. But now all the investigation they carry out serves corporations, serves a right-wing agenda, serves all the nefarious
Mm,
bodies in our society. So it's a complete shift that's taking place in all these media, and that's one of the biggest problems we face. And I think that explains why Plus 972 is able to do what it does with so limited resource, such limited resource, whereas these multi-billion-pound corporations, media corporations,
mm.
completely negligent in their duties. Yes,
Can I just say on that point, I just read yesterday, I wasn't aware of this. You know, BBC has this
verify.
flagship program, which
Oh,
I'm sure
sorry.
you're
Mm.
familiar with, Question Time, where they
Yes.
invite, politicians and others to interact with the audience. I just learned Jeremy Corbyn, who served as the official leader of the opposition for 5 years and has been a member of parliament, I think, for 40 or 40 some years, has been on that program precisely once his entire life.
Yeah.
Nigel Farage, who's the leader of a small opposition party, now, of course, in significant part thanks to the BBC, doing much better in the polls, but he's hardly been a national leader. He has been on dozens of times.
Yeah.
So BBC, despite being constantly denounced by Tel Aviv Tommy Robinson and others, BBC is basically serving two interests above all else. The British and European far right and Israel. Those are the two that have that whose messages have been more amplified by the BBC than any other message in recent years.
Mm. I mean, even in my case, for good 20 years, I used to watch Question Time religiously.
Mm.
From the age of, I would say, 16, 17. But then for the last 10 years, I can't remember a single episode I watched. I just lost interest in Question Time because it just seemed like such a propaganda, the Question Time propaganda show. So they lost me and they lost many, many millions of others because of these reasons you just
Yeah, well,
cited.
Tommy
Yeah.
Robinson can watch it in prison. So,
Yeah. Us finish with this other extraordinary revelation last week about Douglas Murray and David Frum, the guy who came up with the term axis of evil before the
mm,
9/11. Well,
mm,
US embarked on its war in Iraq in 2003. So these two individuals have been exposed as writing the speech for UN, the Israel's ambassador to the UN, Ron Prosa in 2014, which is an extraordinary revelation, given how, especially in the case of Douglas Murray, he he constantly tells us how about his journalistic credentials. One should not or one must not speak on certain issues unless they have these journalistic credentials, and this is something he insists on a number of his shows. And now it turns out he's the biggest, although he claims to be a neutral journalist, he has been lobbying for Israel to the extent of writing a speech for Israel's UN representative, which is quite an extraordinary thing. Same goes for David Frum as well.
well, it's a very simple answer. Imagine if they had discovered that two prominent journalists who have been critical of Israel had been writing speeches, not for Hamas, um, but for the Palestinian ambassador to the Palestinian representative to the United Nations. Just imagine what their response would have been. They would have become absolutely hysterical, gone into complete overdrive, made this a case study of how these journalists are never to be trusted and should be evicted from the profession and so on. We're not even Palestinians. Imagine that it had emerged that they were writing speeches, for the Norwegian or Spanish or Brazilian representative to the United Nations. That would have permanently destroyed their reputation as far as these Israeli agents, Douglas Murray and David Frum, are concerned. Well, what we know their response should have been is precisely what our response to them should be, particularly Murray, who specializes in getting high and mighty, whose default attitude towards anything is sanctimony, who goes on who is now, we learn, even more embedded into Israel's official narrative than we thought possible. In addition to taking IDF guided tours to the Gaza Strip, posing as a conquering war hero in the chair where Yahya Sinwar was ultimately killed. The guy is a complete fraud. Douglas Murray is a sham. Douglas Murray is a tool of a genocidal apartheid regime. We always knew that. We're going to get even more proof than we already have.
I think it's another example of every accusation, every allegation is an confession. Because I'm sure.
If I may, sorry to interrupt you, Nassim. What I would be very interested in learning, because I haven't looked into it yet, when Palestinian journalists were being murdered one after the other, after the other, after the other, were Murray and Frum, as part of their services, as part of their role as agents of a foreign state, were they also seeking to justify and rationalize? Were they celebrating these murders? That I would be very interested.
Well, they're definitely trying to rationalize and justify throughout the past 2 years. That's what they've been doing, and whether they're doing it from with being embedded in the Israeli propaganda machine, we don't know. Maybe we'll find out. But he is only one of few journalists who was escorted, a trip to the Gaza Strip.
There's a lot more to come. Yeah. I'm absolutely certain.
Okay, Mouin, it was, as always, great to see you.
And likewise, thank you, Nassim.
Thank you also for tuning in. See you next week for another episode of Palestine This Week. Bye-bye.